Good morning. My name is Linda Rosenthal. I'm the chair of the Economic Forum. Let's adjourn the meeting, the December 5th meeting of the Economic Forum. We'll start with agenda item number 1, which is roll call. Turn it over to Tom.
Mr. Chrome? Mr. Gordon?
Are we live in Carson City?
Yes, we're live, Chair. Can you hear me, Chair?
We don't hear Carson City.
Everyone's talking. I only see one guy sitting at the end.
Can you hear us in Carson City?
Yes, we can, Chair.
Okay, great. Super. So we're going to proceed with agenda item number 1, which is the roll call. I'll turn it over to Tom for that.
Mr. Chrome?
Present.
Mr. Gordon?
Present.
Mr. Levitt?
Here.
Vice Chair Lewis?
Here.
Chair Rosenthal?
Here. Thank you. The next agenda item is opening remarks. I have a few remarks to make. So good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome the members, the presenters, staff, and any members of the public to our December 5th meeting of the Economic Forum. I would also like to thank LCB's broadcast and production services staff for their assistance prior to the meeting this morning, or prior to the meeting and this morning. I realize it is a lot of work and appreciate everyone from BPS working with the members, presenters, staff, and the public to make it possible for us to hold this meeting. Before we get started today, I'd like to welcome Brian Gordon as the newest member of the forum. Mr. Gordon was recently appointed to fill the term of Vincent Zahn, who took a job out of state and resigned from the forum following the May meeting. Thank you, Mr. Gordon, for being willing to serve on the forum for this meeting, and best of luck to Mr. Zahn in his future endeavors. It is important to point out that the forum will not be considering or approving any revised revenue forecasts at this meeting, and that it is not the intent of the meetings in December of the odd-numbered years. We will have staff present the actions approved by the legislature during the 2023 session that impacted general fund revenue sources, along with the estimated revenue impact on forecasts approved at our May 1st meeting. Additionally, we will have a presentation on how the actual collections for FY 2023 compared to the forum forecast for this fiscal year, as well as the detailed forecast accuracy report that has been updated to reflect the results for fiscal year 2023 and for the 21 to 23 biennium. Finally, there will be presentations by staff on the informational items that have generally been presented at these meetings in December and of the odd-numbered years. However, before getting to these items, we will have a presentation on the updated state unemployment outlook since the May meeting from David Schmidt with the Research and Analysis Bureau of the Department of Employment, Training, and Rehabilitation. Also, Christopher Wright, the new state demographer, will provide us information on the state population outlook as has been done at prior meetings. With that, I would like to ask whether any of the other forum members have any opening remarks they would like to make. Let's go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Rosenthal. Just wanted to say thank you to the members of the Economic Forum for allowing me to join, and Governor Lombardo for the appointment, and look forward to making some contributions here as part of this committee. I'll also be abstaining on item number 4, the approval of the minutes, since I was not a participant of the Economic Forum at that time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Okay. So that being said, we're going to go ahead now and proceed with public comment under agenda item number 3. We'll start here in Las Vegas, then go to Carson City, and finally take any public comment over the phone. As has been done at prior meetings, I will ask Mr. Nakamoto, as staff to the forum, to assist me in conducting today's agenda. So let's turn to Las Vegas. Is there anybody in the room here in Las Vegas who would like to make a public comment? Not seeing anyone. Is there anyone in Carson City? Okay, nobody there. And then finally, over the phone, is anybody logged in to make a public comment via telephone?
Chair, the public line is open and working, but there are no callers at this time.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next action item is agenda item number 4, approval of the minutes of the May 1st, 2023 meeting.
I'd like to make a motion for approval.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? That motion passes. Next, we will have the presentation on the state employment outlook from David Schmidt, Chief Economist, Research and Analysis Bureau, Department of Employment Training and Rehabilitation. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you to Madam Chair and members of the forum for the opportunity to present today. I'm just pulling up my presentation now. And you said we're starting with a review and an update for how things have changed since May. And the high-level answer to that is things are largely as they have been through the second half of 2023. Our employment growth rate has remained pretty stable, and our unemployment rate has also remained pretty stable. And so the short answer is things haven't changed too much, but I wanted to give you an update on where things stand. We've continued to see steady employment growth since recovering from the COVID pandemic. This slide shows you the growth that we've seen in the last 3 recessions, and what I like to point out is that not all recessions are the same. The 2001 recession obviously was fairly shallow. The Great Recession was large and wide, and the COVID recession was very quick, very deep, but we recovered pretty quickly. And one of my favorite talking points here is that we've, since recovering the jobs that were lost in the COVID pandemic, we've continued to grow in terms of our employment at about 4.2% since we recovered all the jobs that we've lost. And so our employment growth rate has been pretty strong. It is a little bit less. Right now we're growing at about 3.4%. But in that time that we've been recovering, we've also been the number 1 or number 2 state in terms of our employment growth rate each month throughout this whole recovery period. That's true with our most recent data, where we were edged out ever so slightly by Idaho, but we continue to see some of the fastest employment growth in the state. You can see here we've been pretty strong, and we're stronger to a pretty significant degree than most other states. You can see here about 1/3 of the states have growth rates above 2%. Only 2 states have growth rates above 3%, and we are currently growing at 3.4%. And so we've continued to not only recover, but expand at a relatively rapid pace. This is true in both of our metropolitan statistical areas, with growth in both the Reno area and the Las Vegas area. Depending on the period that you look at, the recovery here has been a little bit faster, a little bit lower. The Las Vegas MSA here is on the top. The Reno MSA is on the bottom, but both of them are growing solidly and are well above the level that they were at prior to the COVID recession. We've also seen this growth across pretty much every industry in the state. The accommodation industry, and in particular the casino hotel industry, does continue to remain a little bit more than 10% down from where it was prior to the pandemic. It's not growing very fast. It has been creeping up slowly, but my expectation here is that is what we will continue to see, that there won't be a large rapid recovery of the 20,000 or so jobs, that we still remain down from where we were prior to the pandemic. But across other industries, You can see here in green the share of recovery that we've seen, that it's pretty strong, and it's strong in some industries that pay well above the average annual wage in the state. And so as we're growing into new industries, one of the trends that I'll highlight again later is that this should be helping to, in the long term, support our wages as we do see more employment in higher paid industries than we've experienced in the past. I mentioned casino hotels and the slight growth you can see here. This is a long-term trend. This is nothing new. Peak casino hotel employment in Las Vegas was in about 2006. In the Reno-Sparks MSA, it was back in 1997 when the Silver Legacy opened. Those employment levels have been pretty flat. They were pretty flat coming out of the Great Recession. Jobs went down and then went sideways. The Reno MSA has seen this trend even more with a long flat trend where as you go through recessions, you tend to see some employment dip and then either go flat in terms of Las Vegas or down a bit in Reno. And so the casino industry, while it is one of the very unique things about our state, has not been a source of growth for the last couple of decades. And I think that this is sort of a counterpoint to the trepidation you might feel is like, oh, casino employment is down. What does that mean for the state as a whole? That means things are largely as they have been. The state has been growing for a while in other areas and is continuing to do that. Where are we growing? These next couple of charts show some of the areas where we see relatively rapid growth, where we're #1 in the country, are in durable goods employment, where we've been seeing some pretty significant growth, 6.8% in the most recent month. Also professional, scientific, and technical services. This is a subset of the professional and business services industry, but this is more of the high entry-level academic requirement sort of occupations. It's not just broad temporary help, which also falls into professional and business services, but it's that scientific and technical component where we've been seeing growth recently of nearly 11%, again, #1 in the country. At the same time, we are seeing employment growth, and as we diversify, this should put some upward pressure on wages, but at the same time, Nevada's wage growth currently is actually pretty low. We're the third lowest state in the nation over the last, over the year. It averaged over 3 months because this data can be a little bit noisy. And our total average hourly wage for all employees is one of the lower rates in the country. And one of the factors that's contributing to this is the unemployment rate that we have in the state. It's a normal sort of phenomenon. If you have a looser labor market, there's less wage pressure. And so Nevada's unemployment rate is #1 in the country. We've been in this roughly 5.5% or a little bit lower than that area for the last year and a half or so. Our unemployment rate has been very steady and refuses to budge. And so I get to say this every month. We have pretty much the fastest employment growth in the country and the highest unemployment rate in the country. But I think it's interesting, if you look at some of the states that have very low rates of unemployment here, states like Montana or Maryland or the others that are at the bottom of this chart, if we go back to look at the average hourly wages, these are also usually the states that are near the top. Montana is #1 in the country with a wage growth rate that's nearly 10%. Vermont also up over 7.5%. There's several states that have very rapid wage growth because their labor markets are very, very tight and it's hard to find workers. And so there's a lot of competition. And so this benefits workers. It is a cost for businesses though. And so there are some trade-offs there. Nevada having not a high unemployment rate, 5% once upon a time would have been considered pretty much full employment, even though almost every state has an unemployment rate significantly less than 5% right now, where you have a couple of states that have unemployment rates of less than 2%. And so this is a very unique time. The unemployment rate is very low nationally. It's not very low in Nevada, but it is not too far above what we would consider pretty much full employment. And so that does make it a little bit easier to find workers. And as we talk about people who are unemployed, especially to talk about that paradox of rapid employment growth and higher unemployment, thinking about reasons people can become unemployed really plays into what's going on in Nevada. There's a couple of main reasons you can be unemployed: through job exit. So you were laid off, you quit, a business closed. For whatever reason, you lost a job or left a job that you had. The other reason people can be unemployed is that they're coming into the labor market. You have graduated from school, you have moved to the area, you were retired and you've decided you want to do some part-time work. You were watching your kids and now they've gone off to school. All sorts of different reasons people may have been outside of the labor market are coming in. And in Nevada, this is what we see a lot more. Most of the unemployed people that we have in the state, the majority are not job losers. They are either someone who left a job or they're coming into the labor market. So it has a more voluntary component to it. And so what we're seeing is people, to a large degree, coming into the labor market and looking for work and then finding work. And so we've seen increases in our short-term unemployment rate, but not our long-term unemployment rate as much. We've seen increases in people who are unemployed for reasons other than job loss, but we're pretty flat for people who are unemployed because of job loss. This chart looks at the short-term and the long-term unemployment rates. On the horizontal axis, we have people who have been unemployed for 15 or more weeks. On the vertical axis, we have people who have been unemployed under 15 weeks. And this is through the third quarter, 12-month average through the third quarter of 2023. The black line there would represent a balance. If you had equal numbers of people in a particular state that were long-term and short-term unemployed. So every state is in this higher concentration in short-term unemployment. This makes sense because unemployment is very low. But I think it's interesting, Nevada is not number one with a bullet like we are with the unemployment rate in terms of long-term unemployment. We're relatively high, but not the highest. Where we do stand out the most is in that short-term unemployment, which I think is largely driven by people who are coming into the labor force and looking for work, which I think is a positive sign for the opportunities for ongoing economic expansion in the state. Also looking at how people are employed and what the potential might be to grow further. This chart looks at the total labor force in terms of each of the boxes. Each box represents about 10,000 individuals. And we have three shades of blue. The darkest blue is people who are employed full-time. This is the most common employment arrangement in the state. The next largest share is people who are employed part-time, but not for economic reasons. People who are employed part-time for economic reasons are people who have had their hours cut, or they are looking for full-time work and can't find it. This is wrapped into other ways of measuring unemployment, but that is a pretty small share. Most people who are working part-time don't say it's because they had their hours cut and they're not looking for full-time work, and so they're in this kind of voluntary part-time employment place. And so this, I think, is a bit of a constraint. There aren't a lot of workers left in the workforce who are just like, man, I wish I could find a full-time job, but there aren't any out there for me. Most people who are part-time want to be. And so there's relatively little space to grow full-time employment from people who are part-time and just looking for something more. Similarly, if we look at the flip side, this is people who are outside of the labor force. Here, all of the gray squares are people who are either employed or unemployed, and instead we have these shades of red. The dark red is people who are outside the labor force and don't want a job. They are retired. They want to stay at home. They, for whatever reason, have no interest in work. They're not looking for work. They don't say they want a job. They're out. Then we have this box of about 40,000 individuals who say that they want a job, but they haven't searched in the past year. If you searched in the last month, you would be considered unemployed. If you've searched in the last year, then you might be outside of the labor force, but sort of in that potentially available pool. Of those who have searched in the past year and want a job, another 10,000 or so of them aren't currently available for work. So they have looked, but something is preventing them from being available right now. And then finally, we have about 20,000 people who have searched in the past year and are available, but have not searched in the past month. And that's another 20,000 or so. And so there's some opportunities to continue to pull people in Nevada, but not in the labor force, into the labor force. But this is also a fairly tight number. You can see most people outside the labor force want to be. Another way of looking at what's going on in the state in terms of our employment and unemployment data, is to look at the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, or JOLTS, data that's produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I will highlight for Nevada, this data can be pretty volatile. It's something that doesn't have a huge sample size, and so it's always important to treat it with a little bit of a grain of salt. Here, our hire rate, so they're measuring people coming in. How many new hires have you had? How many job openings do you have? How many layoffs have you had? Our normal employment numbers are reported on a net basis. Our total employment number was this, our total employment number grew to this. The change of that is 3.4%, and that's what we will usually report every month through a more robust survey. This lets us look a little bit at the underlying data, because one of the things I think is interesting is this churn rate, which is at the bottom of the table. And this is a way of trying to capture how many hires did you have and how many separations did you have? Because as you can see, the latest data has 61,000 hires and 59,000 total separations. And so most of the hiring effort that's taking place is to fill vacancies that have been created. This is normal. You can see the lowest ever churn rate that we had was 51.5%. So in the single lowest month for hires, not just replacing separations, it was still more than half of the total activity that happened. But I think that helps to explain why we might be at number 29 for hires, even though we're number 1 for employment growth, because we're very much in the middle. We aren't churning through a bunch of hires to replace a bunch of people who are leaving. We're a little bit more balanced in that measure compared to other states. And I think that's kind of interesting. If I look at Montana again, because it's geographically large and easy to see, they have a pretty high hire rate. They have a very high wage growth rate, and they also have a really high separation rate. And so you have a lot more of this turnover in the labor force pushing those wage expectations higher. In Nevada, we're a little bit more, again, in the middle of the road in terms of these measures. I also think it's interesting to note that total turnover in Nevada, and this is looking at Las Vegas and Reno using quarterly data that the Census Bureau puts together, just how much the Great Recession impacted turnover in Nevada. That we were in this 14, 12, 10% area for a long time until the Great Recession, when we dropped to a little bit above 8%. And you can see here the long recovery in that turnover rate, where people have been starting to turn over a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. The numbers then get very spiky during COVID. But we're just now getting back to the point that we were at in 2003, 2004, prior to the housing boom, prior to the Great Recession. And so I like to frame this sometimes as, if you didn't see this chart, would you think that turnover today is the highest it's ever been? It kind of feels that way sometimes, but actually the level of turnover that we're seeing is just now recovering from the hit that it took during the Great Recession and the impacts that had on the labor market and the way that people were approaching their work and their willingness to look for other opportunities and try to find a better job and find a different employment. We've been kind of low for a while, and we're kind of recovering back to what will probably be, if I would have a takeaway from this chart, probably will have a higher level of overall turnover going forward than we've seen in the past, which I do think, again, will put some upward pressure on total wages. So to summarize, what are my expectations from looking at these charts? I think we'll continue to see pretty decent employment growth, but we will continue to slow. We won't be 4 or 5%. My expectation was that by the end of this year we would be getting down to about 3%. Maybe now I'd say about 3.2%, but we're continuing to be steady, but coming down a little bit. Eventually, we should see the unemployment rate coming down as the participation rate is continuing to recover. We are continuing to absorb people into the workforce. But as the unemployment rate starts to come down, those labor force conditions will get tighter. It will get harder to find workers, and we will probably see some upward pressure on wages as a result. In the longer term, I think population growth is the biggest constraint that we have to employment growth. That Nevada, once upon a time, had 6% employment growth. We set some very high numbers in the 90s and 2000s as we were growing rapidly, but as our population growth is a little bit more constrained, our employment growth will be a bit more constrained. In part, the high cost of housing that we see will probably have some negative impacts for domestic migration, which supports our population growth, which supports our employment growth. We will continue to see more employment growth outside of the casino and leisure industries into those manufacturing and technical services and other areas that we've been seeing. And that as we have that diversifying employment growth and a tightening labor market, again, wage pressures will probably be continuing to rise. And that is all of the slides that I have for you, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that members of the forum may have.
You know, the last time we met was on May 1st, in which time we, as you well know, prepared estimates for the revenues for the state. Could you give us how, if any, has your view of the economy, general economy, changed from that date to the present? Do you see it getting better? Do you see it getting worse? Do you see it about the same? Trying to get a feel for where, you know, what's happened since we last gave our revenue estimates.
So thank you very much for the question, and David Schmidt again for the record. I think pretty much about the same. We have been in a very steady place as far as our employment and unemployment data has gone. We haven't seen a lot of change. We've seen a small downward shift in terms of our employment growth, but that was kind of what I expected to see happen. If anything, it's come in ever so slightly stronger than I was expecting. But you know, if I were to say, is it better? Is it worse? Is it about the same? 85% about the same. Yeah, maybe 10% better. Maybe there's a few areas that are lower. I would have thought that our unemployment rate would be creeping down a bit more than it has, but it's been offset by people coming into the labor force, which I like to argue it's good unemployment. I think we've had a high unemployment rate for good reasons, and I would rather have 5.5% and people coming into the labor force than 4.5% with people staying on the sidelines. And so I think that's the best way to think about it. So look, I was expecting a lower unemployment rate. The number is higher, but for a good reason. So I guess that I could put in the positive category too.
For the record, Linda Rosenthal, just a quick question. You talked about the manufacturing and the technical services growing. I think construction historically, was an area where Nevada was maybe over-reliant. Then it went through some tough times during, times of economic turmoil. But it seems very robust today. So maybe construction, mining, some of the main areas of industry that we've had historically. Can you just talk about how they're trending?
Yep. So David Schmidt again for the record. And I'm sorry I don't have the charts in front of me, or I would throw them up because I love to talk with images. But the high level numbers are construction is solid, but it's still below where it was. The Reno Sparks MSA, you're just now starting to see construction employment increase to the sorts of levels that we saw in the housing boom in terms of total number of people. But obviously the MSA itself is larger than it was at that point in time. The Las Vegas area is still lagging behind that. We're getting up to maybe like pre-housing boom levels of construction employment, like 2002, 2003, 2004, and that, not the 2005, 6, 7 explosion that we saw. And so we're solid, but I would say that we're still below the potential capacity to develop that we have without being sort of overly reliant on just building a bunch of houses. So construction as a share of the economy, still not what it was. I think still in a pretty solid place and still with room to grow as the other non-residential investment around the area is also there to support it. Overall, I'd say that those numbers are pretty solid. Mining employment has basically been flat. It has not seen a lot of growth, a lot of change. I think the biggest potential on the horizon there is as you're getting beyond just the gold mining industries into some of the potential for rare earth materials and other associated minerals. That's where I would look to see the potential for growth in the mining industry, in the next several years.
Thank you. And then just one more for me. On the average wages, I know you had the chart that showed the higher wage type sectors growing. So presumably that means the overall state's average wage is growing as well. There were also some incentives, for instance, with Tesla and some people out at Trip to pay, I think, above the average state wage, whatever that is. What are you seeing in the average wage trends in the state?
So David Schmidt again for the record, and the overall numbers for the state change pretty slowly. We still have by far the highest concentration in the country of employment in accommodation, which tends to pay wages that are well below the overall average wage, both in the state and nationally. But within industries, we have seen pretty significant growth. So I looked, it was probably several months ago now, at where we were seeing growth specifically in the manufacturing industry to try to say, is it the case that we have a single industry that may have been incentivized and it's growing really large, but instead what we see is that we are growing across the board. And so we're seeing lots of growth in lots of different sectors in the manufacturing industry. So it's not there's one thing and it's changing the data for everybody, but we are generally growing. We have a generally positive trend there, and it's lifting up industries across the board in terms of that employment. We are also seeing rapid growth within the leisure and hospitality industry. Leisure and hospitality has actually recovered the total number of jobs that it had before the pandemic. But what's happened is it's shifted. We are still down in accommodation, but we are higher in arts, entertainment, and recreation, as well as in food service industries. And food service actually has lower wages than accommodation. The numbers in my head are probably about a year old, so this is only a rough estimate, but where accommodation would pay $650 in average weekly wages, food services has an average weekly wage of closer to $450. And so we've seen more growth in the lower wage side of leisure and hospitality overall, I think, as people in their spending are going to that sort of experience side of the tourism industry more broadly, the nice restaurants and the additional options there that we have. And so there are some areas that are growing that are lower wage, but across most of the industries, and I would just point you to that green and red chart, which is in your meeting packet, to see, I think 42% of the jobs that we have are in industries that are more than 10% recovered and pay an average weekly wage above the state average. So it's not 50, 60%, but a lot of the growth that we've seen has been in things that will be pushing up our average wages overall.
I was going to ask, do you think we'll see a kind of a bump up in the hotel employment since we're getting a couple new casinos, including one today? Do you think that'll make an impact on our kind of cutting down that difference from our peak?
David Schmidt again for the record, and it's an interesting question. If you look at the trend in Las Vegas casino hotel employment from the chart, you can see in sort of the middle of the recovery period there, a time when we did have a property open, and it did temporarily increase the overall employment levels. But then that kind of got absorbed back into the baseline, and it returned to where it was before that opening, before we got to the COVID pandemic. And so that's kind of the question is, will we see an increase that then continues to grow? We have seen that in the past, but we saw it more in the rapid expansion of the strip back in the 1990s and early 2000s. And so there is the potential for something opening to create a level shift. But until I see it happen, my expectation would probably be that there will be a more temporary bump, and then the overall employment will kind of sort back out to what it was like when we saw, I think, Resorts World opening up.
Thank you.
Brian Gordon for the record. Thank you, Mr. Schmidt. I think the report's been great and good information, and got a few of my questions answered along the way. Can you just help us understand how you look at and report on gig workers, folks that largely during the pandemic decided to sort of go into business for themselves or go into some other type of employment situation, and how we should just be thinking about that as it relates to the report here?
Certainly, and David Schmidt again for the record. That's a really good question with not a lot of great data to support it. So it's certainly one of the challenges in our establishment-based employment estimates, which is what we use for most of the total employment data that we have. That would not capture someone that's a gig worker. So these are, there's a few different definitions, but for the most part, this data won't include that. It would be included in the household-based employment estimates, because if that's just asking, are you employed? Did you earn money this week? And so whether you did that as someone who's self-employed or someone who's working for pay from a company, you would be included there. One of the challenges that we have coming out of the pandemic is that the estimates from these two different programs don't line up the same way that they used to. And so it's sort of an ongoing issue that we're working to see, you know, what is causing these different responses from these survey programs. But it's one of the challenges that we have in working with the data right now that make it hard to answer that with the amount of specificity that we would like. I know that the total estimates of self-employment levels that we had from around 2000, 2001 were that we have somewhere in the ballpark, depending on how you defined it, of 75 to 150,000 people that have self-employment as their primary form of income. I think oftentimes what you will see is that there are people who will layer it on top of other employment that they have. And so you might have one person who's entirely reliant on self-employment income as a gig worker, and you might have someone who's supplementing it on top of another job. And so sort of pulling apart the pieces to say, you know, what do you do and how much of your employment is it? Is sort of an ongoing question. I wish I had better data to answer your question.
Brian Gordon, for the record, that's a perfectly fair answer, and I totally appreciate that. Is your sense that the self-employed segment of the economy, that's not, and let me ask it a different way, do you feel that masks anything that you've reported here, or do you think the trends are generally consistent with what you've shared with us today?
David Schmidt, for the record, I would say that it's probably a supplement. I don't think that it you know, our unemployment rate would be significantly lower because our unemployment rate does come from the household survey. And so that should include people who are self-employed as well as people who are not. And so I don't think that the presence of gig workers would significantly change the overall sort of economic picture from these other data sources.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to make a comment. Relates to the question of the chairman. You know, in the past, we've seen when it relates to construction employment, those of us who have been on the committee for a while remember when we had construction employment that was really exceptionally strong. And I suppose at the time we were happy with that, but what happens, of course, is that the slightest indication the economy is going downhill, then we can lose a substantial part of the employment. So it sounds like to me anyway that the construction employment is good, but it's not excessively good, which probably puts us in about the position that we want to be in as relates to the future economic growth.
Linda Rosenthal, for the record. I mean, I agree. That was kind of the point of my question. I think it sounds like the state's in a great position. You know, unemployment, like you said, high compared to other states, but not high overall. Great growth, broader diversification among the sectors that are driving employment growth, much less dependent on historical growth drivers that were subject more to probably economic downturns. And so I think it's a nice setup, you know, for the future prospects for continued growth in the state. So, if there aren't any other questions, I think that's it for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next agenda item is agenda item number 6, the presentation on the state population outlook from Christopher Wright, the state demographer, Department of Taxation.
This is Chris Wright, the Nevada State Demographer. Thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about the state population outlook. For the agenda, I'm going to talk about the components of change, demographic characteristics of the state, and the most recent population projections. First, we'll start with the components of change. When we look at the basic demographic formula, we see the estimate. We see to estimate a population at a given time, we need to start with the population at a previous time, and we add in the natural increase, which is the total births minus the total deaths for the time period, as well as the net migration, which is the immigration minus immigration. Earlier this year, there were headlines that said the U.S. birth rate has dropped as women wait to have babies. Looking at a more detailed representation by year and age group, we see that the trend that women are waiting longer to have fewer babies. The chart on the left shows the birth rates from 2021 to 2022 declined for females aged 15 to 24 and rose for women aged 25 to 29 and 35 to 44. The chart on the right shows the provisional general fertility rate, GFR, for the United States in 2022. It was 56.1 births per 1,000 women aged 15 to 44, which is down less than 1% from 2021, which was 56.3. The provisional number of births for the United States in 2022 showed a decline from the number in 2021, which rose 1% from 2020. So for Nevada specifically, if we look back over the last 2 decades, we can see that there's a similar trend in total births that mirrors the national trend. For the fertility rate, for the population of women of childbearing age, which is 15 to 44, we can see a steady decline in the fertility rate for Nevada. Next, I'll talk about the natural change. To get natural change, you subtract the deaths from births to derive the natural change. In 2019, pre-COVID, there were 8 counties in Nevada that were already reporting a negative natural change, which meant there was more deaths than births, with 1 reporting a single-digit increase in net births. By 2020, the number had increased to 9 counties with 0 or negative natural change, and 2 with single-digit birth increases. For 2021, we had 13 counties with negative natural change and 1 reporting single-digit net births. As of 2022, it is estimated that we still have 13 counties with negative natural change. Only Clark, Elko, Humboldt, and Washoe counties have significant births over deaths. Obviously, COVID has impacted 2021, but even if we look into the pre-COVID trend, you can see there's an obvious decline in natural growth in our state. When we look at migration, the domestic migration, the population migration shifts within the United States. It's what's been the primary driver for population growth in Nevada for the past several decades. There's not really a direct measure for these shifts, but the IRS does produce data based on tax returns, which it tends to lag by a couple of years. This latest data was published in May and shows the migration patterns based on returns filed between 2020 and 2021. Although the data does have its issues, it offers some information on domestic migration patterns into the state. As we can see, most counties in the state showed net population gains from 2020 to 2021. However, comparing those to the previous period of 2019 and 2020, there was nearly a 33% decrease in the net inflow year to year. But of course, some of that is due to the pandemic. Another way to look at the domestic migration, some of the moving companies put out a study and publish this annually. For example, in the U-Haul's latest figures, Nevada rose from number 29 in 2021 to number 13 in 2022 for inbound moves. United Van Lines has shown Nevada consistently slipping since 2018 down to number 31 nationally for inbound moves in 2021. For 2022, Nevada rose to 26. In North American band lines shows that in 2021, outbound moves have overtaken inbound moves in Nevada for the first time since 2012, and that trend continues into 2022. So to summarize, the components of population change, fertility rates continue to decline nationally, and that is reflected in Nevada as well. Our natural increase continues to decline, which was accelerated by the pandemic initially. Indications are that domestic migration to Nevada is slowing, although more data is needed. Demographic characteristics of the state. Nevada is getting
Mr.
older.
Wright?
Yes.
Sorry
Sorry.
to interrupt, but before we go on, I just have a quick question on this section. This is Linda Rosenthal for the record. So just curious on the natural change, you seem to be reporting the trends based on the number of counties that are increasing or decreasing, but you did mention that Washoe and Clark are some of the ones that are continuing to increase, and that is obviously where most of the population is.
That's correct.
Overall for the state, is there a decline in the natural change?
Yes, there is.
Not county by county, but.
Yes,
Okay.
total state, yes. I don't have that.
Is it,
I don't have that figure actually in front of me because I didn't put it in the presentation. But yes, statewide there is a decrease. I can get that number. I don't have it.
that's okay. I was just curious if, not basing it on number of counties, but just basing it on overall numbers, if there was still
Overall, yeah.
decline, and you're saying yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
One other question. It's Michael Kroom for the record. So to follow up on her question, so you're saying there is a natural decrease overall, or just that it's not increasing as rapidly?
It's a decrease overall. So we're having more deaths than births.
Okay, but then on the just on the natural change piece, though.
Natural change, yes.
We're talking about the immigration versus inflow versus outflow. That is increasing, but just not as rapidly. Is that right?
So it looks like, there's different studies, and that's what was hard about this answering that question, is because the data is very subjective. So with the IRS, it looks like, yes, with the IRS data that I used, it looks like there still is an increase. It just has decreased. So it's not as big. You know what I'm saying? So it's shrunk, but it's not as much as it was. The growth rate is less. I guess.
Right, but it's still growing.
Yes.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's the clarity I wanted. Thanks.
All right. So when you compare the 2010 decennial census to the latest 2022 vintage census estimates, the median age for Nevada has increased to 38.9 years old, which is equal to the national median age. Looking at the change between 2010 and 2022, we can see that most Nevada counties increased their median age and 3 dropped in age. Statewide, the median has increased by 2.6 years, which was faster than the national increase. Race and ethnicity. So on the left side is a chart comparing the racial and ethnic distribution in the Nevada population in the 2010 census estimate base, shown in the inner ring, and the latest 2022 vintage census estimate shown in the outer ring. You can see the proportional increases for each racial and ethnic group except the white alone category, which decreased during that time period. This is also illustrated on the right, which visualizes each category by the rate of change. The largest increase was reported in the 2 or more races category, followed by Black or African American, Asian, and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. Lastly, I'll share with you the summary of my latest population projections that we published on October 1st. These projections are primarily based on an independent econometric model produced by Regional Economic Models Incorporated, or REMI. This model has been used by the state demographer for over 20 years. REMI is a well-regarded model that has existed since the 1980s and is used by various state and local governments and academic institutions. The latest release for these projections was published in June. It was updated to include sector employment data through the third quarter of 2022, and the employment forecast for upcoming economic development projects from the Governor's Office of Economic Development were also included. So overall, the model showed a cumulative population increase of over 500,000 over the course of the next 20 years. It also showed a general slowing of the population growth rate during that period. Although growth is projected, it is not forecast to be at the pace that we've seen in recent decades. To provide some detail on the projections, the model showed a gradual decline in growth for the two most populous counties, as well as the rural counties in the state over the next 20 years. In prior years, projections showed rural counties with a slight growth, but now show a gradual decline. Of course, with the projections, there are always risks to consider. The employment recovery coming out of the pandemic has been strong, which is also included in the model, that the employment data from that time. Housing availability is a potential limiting factor that is not considered in the model. Therefore, growth projections may not be realistic if counties don't have the housing to support the population. The model may not be entirely predicting employee commuting patterns, which can affect the population distribution among neighboring counties, especially in rural areas. The model does attempt to forecast international migration, but this is greatly dependent on a policy set at the national level. Likewise, fluctuations in domestic migration patterns should be considered when interpreting the projections. Lingering effects of the pandemic, threat of global conflict, and resource limitations and economic volatility will certainly impact long-term population projections. That's all I have as far as slides, but I'm open for questions.
This is Linda Rosenthal for the record. Just a question on the housing. I think it was mentioned also in David Schmidt's presentation, affordability and/or access to housing. Do you happen to know like where Nevada ranks amongst the states in terms of those two things, affordability and availability of housing?
I don't know.
Okay, I was just curious. Seems like, you know, every time you turn around, there's another multifamily building being built, seeming to indicate that, you know, there's great demand for housing, for affordable housing for sure. And, you know, to the extent we have a very big state with most of our land kind of held by the federal government, the areas where there's opportunity for growth in housing seems to be, you know, getting smaller and smaller. So.
Thank you. Brian Gordon for the record. Just a quick question for you, Mr. Wright. Thanks for sharing the methodology for the population forecasts. I think I understand how you go about doing that. Is there any coordination or, I don't know, cross-checks with local jurisdictions when putting together the statewide estimates? I know there's a bunch of organizations, including the university systems and local county governments that may do some of their own forecasting at the local level. Is any of that how do you all think about that as you work to prepare your projections for the state? Just some of that background might be helpful for us.
When we go to work on these 20-year population projections, this year I didn't have any coordination with the counties or the academic institutions, but moving forward, now that I've been in this position, I think it's a good opportunity to get you know, better information and make these population projections a little more accurate. So I guess the short answer is no, not for these projections, but moving forward, yes.
That's great. Thank you for the feedback. Appreciate it.
It looks like we have no further questions. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
The next item on the agenda is a presentation on the tax changes approved by the legislature during the 2023 session, court decisions relating to actions approved by the legislature during the 2019 session, and the Economic Forum May 1st, 2023 forecast for 23, 24, and 25, adjusted for legislative actions approved during the 2023 session and the 34th and 35th special sessions. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Nakamoto.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the forum. For the record, I am Michael Nakamoto, Chief Principal Deputy Fiscal Analyst with the Fiscal Analysis Division, a title that is almost as long as this agenda item is. We were asked to put all of that on there. But this is the point of the meeting, as you're aware, that it's primarily staff presentations from here. And so we will alternate between three of the members of the staff. So that you are aware, the Fiscal Analysis Division, along with the Governor's Finance Office, serve as staff to the Economic Forum, and it's primarily myself, Mr. Tower and Ms. Powers, who will be doing the presentations today and who have previously served as your staff. Our staff actually has grown by one. Within the last couple of weeks, our division hired Haley Owens, who you may remember was previously the economist at the Department of Taxation for several years. She joined us about 2 weeks ago and will be serving in roles with us as well. And so to the extent that any of you will be continuing in another term with the Economic Forum, when we convene again in June, you will be seeing her there, but we don't have anything for her today. But I will start with agenda item 7, which is the presentation on the tax changes from the last session as well as the special sessions. And everything that I have for this agenda item is in the meeting packet, starting on page 107. On page 107, this is the Economic Forum's forecast for May of 2023. That this body approved at the May 1st meeting. The difference on this table compared to the one that was approved is this includes the legislative changes. And I'm not going to go through this table, at least the changes in this table. They will be in subsequent tables in the meeting packet. But I just wanted to provide this so that you were aware of the forecasts as they stand now. And if there are any questions about any of the forecasts or any refreshers that may be needed on actions that were taken by this body at the May 1st meeting, I would be glad to answer those questions. What I'll do, though, is I'll have you turn to page 117 in the packet. And the set of tables that I'm going to go through today for this agenda item are tables that Fiscal Analysis Division staff, namely me, and Mr. Tower and Ms. Powers, that we put together for the appropriations report that the Fiscal Analysis Division puts out, just kind of as a recap of the legislative session. And so we're responsible for doing the tax and revenue actions for that report. And so page 117 is table 1, and basically what that does is this is kind of a recap of the forecast that was approved by this body at the May 1st meeting, and specifically the tax credits. And I'm not going to go through all of those here, but they're provided as a reference. What I am going to go through, though, is on page 123, and that's table 2. And this is the adjustments that were made to the Economic Forum's May 1st, 2023 forecast based on actions that were approved by the 82nd session, the 2023 legislature, as well as the 35th special session. We have 34th special session in the agenda item, but I will tell you that the legislature did not do anything that affected the Economic Forum forecast in that special session. They waited until the next one. So the next few pages here are just going to walk through, and I'll just kind of go through these very quickly. The first one on page 123 is the net proceeds of minerals tax, and this is one that was actually discussed at the May 1st meeting. At the very beginning of session, the legislature considered and approved Senate Bill 124, which dealt with with the prepayment of the net proceeds of minerals that was put into place during one of the special sessions during the pandemic to address the revenue shortfalls that were occurring as a result of the pandemic. So there was a desire by the legislature to ask that the general fund portion of the net proceeds of minerals tax be prepaid for several fiscal years. The legislature came in during this previous session in SB 124 and reversed that, ended the prepayment 1 year early. So basically what that did is we had a forecast of approximately $71 million in net proceeds of minerals revenue, followed by a so-called hole because the prepayment was going to end, and so there would not be a prepayment for FY24. Instead, the calendar year FY24 payment would be made as actual revenue in FY 2025. During the 2021 session, though, the legislature made the decision that that portion of the net proceeds of minerals revenue previously dedicated to the state general fund would instead go to the state education fund for K-12 education beginning in FY 2024. So that hole in the general fund actually was going to be a hole in the state highway or in the state education fund. And so the legislature decided instead of continuing the prepayment for FY23, they decided to end it in FY23 and create that hole in the general fund in FY23. So the forecasts were reduced from 71.4 million down to about 1.4 million, and so that money, that $70 million that's taken off the sheets, the bulk of that goes to the state education fund in FY24. And so we don't have the adjustment on this page because it was taken into account at the May 1st forecast, but we've documented it because we actually had to make the adjustment to the forecast for December of 2022, which when we get to the next agenda item relating to the actuals compared to the forecast that Mr. Tower will go through, that is accounted for there. The next legislation that is addressed here is Senate Bill 428, dealing with the sales and use tax. And this is a ballot question that will be submitted at the November 2024 general election relating to a proposed sales tax exemption for adult and children's diapers. And so if that is approved, then there will be an exemption for those items beginning January 1st, 2025 until December 31st, 2050. We document it here because it may have an effect on general fund revenue beginning in FY25, but it's contingent upon voter approval of the question at the next election. And so not only would it affect the 2% sales tax, but as you can see, we have the general fund commissions that are listed as well. Those are those revenue items that show up underneath the sales tax on the economic forum sheet. So we don't have estimates and we didn't make any adjustments to the forecast because, again, it's going to depend on the voters approving that for that to be effective. But when the economic forum comes back during the next cycle, we will have an idea of whether that is going to affect revenue in FY25 and going forward. The next item and the last one on this page is for the percentage fees on gross gaming revenue. Senate Bill 266 created an exclusion for cash received as entry fees for the right to participate in contests or tournaments that are conducted on the premises of a licensed gaming establishment. Those were previously considered as gross gaming revenue. They are now excluded. It is not a large impact on the state general fund. As you can see, it was about $1.6 million in FY24 and $1.7 million in FY25. And the difference with that is because the effective date was July 1st and the timing of that tax, it only affects 11 months of FY24, but it affects the full 12 months of FY25. So that's why that number in FY24 is slightly smaller. On the next page, is the insurance premium tax. And this is one where it was a legislative action that was not directly related to the insurance premium tax, but there are indirect effects. And it was Senate Bill 435, which dealt with what is known as a provider tax that would be paid by certain healthcare facilities, private hospitals, and so on. That it has been proposed, and the Department of Health and Human Services Division of Healthcare Financing and Policy is working through the arrangements on this, where a tax would be paid on certain assessment, or there's an assessment that would be made by these facilities to the division, and certain proceeds from that would be used for support and services under Medicaid for certain behavioral health conditions. And I am certainly not an expert on this, but my understanding, based on the information that I have been told, is that this is supposed to happen sometime in FY24. And the end result is, as soon as this money is paid to the state and then is used for Medicaid, the capitation payments, the payments that are made to the managed care organizations through Medicaid, they're considered net consideration for the insurance premium tax, and therefore are subject to that tax. So some of that money actually then comes back to the state in the form of tax revenue. We did not have an idea of the amount of revenue that could be generated from this. At the time that this was put together, it wasn't even sure when or if this was going to be happening. But my understanding is that it will be happening sometime in FY24. And again, when we get to the next forum cycle, hopefully we'll have a better handle on this and build this into the forecast going forward. But it was something that we just wanted the forum to be aware of in terms of legislative actions that could affect general fund revenue, especially the ones that are within the purview of the forum. The next one is the real property transfer tax. Assembly Bill 448 clarified that the current exemption from the real property transfer tax for mere changes in identity, form, or place of organization does not apply if the purpose of the transfer is specifically to evade the tax. The reason we have this on here, again, it's a legislative action that is at some point potentially going to affect the real property transfer tax, but until the Department of Taxation comes up with some sort of regulations on how to administer this, we honestly have no idea of the revenue effects that could be a part of this tax. So it's, again, something on there that we didn't put any numbers on there, but we put it on the tables just as information for the public and for the members of the forum. The next one is one that is a little more clear-cut, and that's the governmental services tax. Since probably the Great Recession, there has been a portion of the governmental services tax that's paid upon the registration or renewal of a registration of a vehicle that goes to either the state highway fund or the state general fund. And that percentage has floated between 100% to the state highway fund, or 100% to the state general fund, down to as low as 25% to the state general fund and 75% to the state highway fund. And that alternated year over year, and we would come in and to economic forum meetings and say, okay, here's the percentage now and here's the forecasts. Senate Bill 452 of the 2023 session finally ended all of that, and now 100% of those proceeds go to the state highway fund, with none of the proceeds going to the state general fund. My recollection is that was the original intent of the bill when it was put into place, is that it would eventually go to the state highway fund, and the legislature finally got there. So you can see that the forecasts, or the numbers that are there, are basically taking what the Economic Forum approved for FY24 and FY25 and zeroing those out, because that money is now going to the state highway fund. The last item under the taxes category is the other tobacco tax, which is one of the minor revenue sources. That's the 30% wholesale on tobacco that is not cigarettes. That tax was revised in Assembly Bill 232 to specify that if it is other tobacco that is considered a premium cigar, and there's a definition that it has does not have a filter or mouthpiece, it's hand wrapped in a leaf and so on and so forth, then it's calculated at 30%, but that tax has to be a minimum of 30 cents per cigar and a maximum of 50 cents per cigar. And that goes into effect, or went into effect on July 1st, 2023, and will stay in effect until June 30th of 2027. And you can see that the effect on the tax is relatively small, of approximately $1 million per year. And hopefully, by the time we come back, we'll have a better idea of what that actually meant. The last item on this page is licenses under commercial recordings, and this is the filing fees and whatnot that the Secretary of State collects and administers. Assembly Bill 260 provided an exemption from any of those fees for certain veteran services organizations, and you can see that this was a very small effect based on the effective date of January 1st, 2024, but it was enough that we documented it and made the adjustment. On the next page, under fees and fines, Senate Bill 145 revised the fine structure that may be imposed by the Labor Commissioner for certain violations of provisions relating to intentional misclassification of employees, and it removed a $2,500 fine that could be imposed by an employer for a first offense of these provisions. And so by taking out that $2,500 fine, there was an estimate from the Labor Commissioner that it would result in a revenue reduction of approximately $10,000 per year. Before I move on to the use and money and property, I'll stop and see if there are any questions on what we've been through first.
I don't have a question, but I can remember when this happened, but somebody had a really good imagination when they called that the government services tax. It's a pretty good way of identifying without giving the slightest hint as to where it comes from, isn't it?
Thank you, Mr. Levitt. Michael Nakamoto for the record. The change of the name of that tax from the motor vehicle privilege tax to the government services tax occurred before my tenure. I believe it was 2001 or 2003 that occurred, but that is a curious observation that you do make. So going forward in use of money and property, a lot of these are loans that the state makes for various purposes, and you can see that the bulk of these went to for IT purposes for the state. And so those would be repaid, but you can see those numbers are blank primarily because the repayment of that money doesn't occur in this biennium. They'll begin in FY 2026. The only one under use of money and property that does have an amount is under the City of North Las Vegas repayment for Windsor Park, and this is Senate Bill 450. And basically, the state provided a loan from the general fund in the amount of $12 million to the housing division of the Department of Business and Industry to provide for funding for the relocation of residents living in the Windsor Park neighborhood of the city of North Las Vegas. And for those of you who are not aware, there has been issues with groundwater subsidence. I hate that word. Basically, there has been a lot of groundwater that has been pumped out of this neighborhood, and it has caused the ground to sink, and which is causing significant structural problems for the houses and other buildings that are located within this. And so the legislature approved a program by which money would be put to this purpose to allow the residents to relocate to other parts of the Las Vegas Valley. And a portion of this was in the form of general fund, which will be paid back by the city of North Las Vegas through their consolidated tax distributions at a rate of $250,000 a month for 4 years. And that began in FY 2024. And so that is what that is showing on there. So on the next page under other revenue on page 126, the first item is Senate Bill 448. And under current law, NRS 176.059, or prior to the passage of this bill, required any time that somebody was found guilty of a misdemeanor or pled guilty to a misdemeanor or some other municipal ordinance violations, they would have to pay an administrative assessment to the court in addition to their fine. And the amount of that assessment varies from $30 to $120. There's a $5 portion of that already goes to the state general fund. But then there was a balance after certain amounts were paid to the court and for some various purposes that were set aside and used for various programs and agencies such as the Criminal History Repository, the court administrator, the Supreme Court, and so on. And then any portion of that revenue after those allocations were made, if there was anything remaining, then it would go to the state general fund. During the legislative session, Senate Bill 448 said we're going to get rid of that distribution, and they were, instead of having these programs rely on this funding, they for their budgets, they were just going to appropriate money. So instead of having just the $5, they're having everything that was left over that would have previously gone to these programs, instead now go to the general fund. So you can see that there was an increase in the forecast by about $15.6 million, which is the balance of that assessment, which would previously have gone to fund these programs, but because they're now receiving appropriations, that money is coming to the general fund. Under cost recovery plan, the statewide cost allocation, which we call SWICAP, is part of the budgeting for the state, and there's some money from that comes back to the state general fund. We have an amount that we put in for the forecast, but the final amount is really dependent on the legislative actions and the budget as it closes. So we actually had to reduce the forecast amount by a little bit, just because it's coming in a little bit lower after the legislative session closed. And then the last item on this page for this table is unclaimed property, and it's Assembly Bill 45. There are, under current law, already 2 transfers from the unclaimed property account to various purposes. There's a transfer of $7.6 million per year to the Millennium Scholarship Program, and then there's an additional $1 million that goes to the grant matching account that was approved during the 2021 session. Assembly Bill 45 added 2 additional transfers, so that after that $7.6 million and the $1 million, there's $2.5 million that goes to the account for student loan repayment for providers of health care in underserved communities. And then there's another $250,000 that would go to the University of Nevada School of Medicine for the purpose of obtaining match money for the Nevada Health Service Corps from the federal government. So in addition to those 2 existing transfers, there's another $2.75 million that gets reduced from the unclaimed property every year, and that's the money that gets taken in from banks and various other places that goes into that unclaimed property account. So anything that's held by the state that they receive, all of this money then has to go out first, and then the remaining proceeds go to the state general fund. So the net result of the forecast that you can see then on the page 127 on the last page is that the total actions on the bottom of page 126 is there was a total net negative adjustment to revenue of approximately $15.3 million in FY24, and then a negative adjustment of approximately $16.2 million in FY25, and that's what the Economic Forum's forecasts for those fiscal years were reduced by. And then you can see the bottom line there, which ties back to the table that you can see. And then that's really it in terms of the legislative actions approved during the regular session. We'll talk about the special session when we get to Table 3, and that's dealing with the tax credits. But for this point, I'll stop and see if there are any questions on the general fund actions.
I don't see any questions. Please proceed.
Right. Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, Michael Nakamoto for the record. Page 129, I'm just going to provide it, or it's part of the information that we provided in the appropriations report. It's not necessarily relevant to this committee because it deals with the State Education Fund, but there were a couple of legislative actions that affected the State Education Fund, so we provided that information rather than just skipping the table. But what I am going to do is have you turn to page 134. And this is the last page, or the last couple of pages of Table 3. And Table 3 is basically going through and summarizing the general fund after legislative adjustments and then now including the tax credits. And the only one that I really want to have you key in on is on page 137. And so during the 35th special session, the legislature considered and ultimately approved legislation regarding a stadium project at the southeast corner of Las Vegas Boulevard in Tropicana for a qualified Major League Baseball stadium. And the relevant part of that as it relates to this body is the issuance of transferable tax credits in the amount of $36 million per year for 5 fiscal years, beginning in FY 2026 is the anticipation. That's why you can see that there are no numbers listed here, because the effect on the general fund is outside of the biennium. But when the forum convenes and considers forecasts in November of next year and then through December and May, the forecasts that will be shown anticipate $36 million in tax credits that will be available against the modified business tax, the gaming percentage fee, and the insurance premium tax beginning in FY 26 and then for 5 fiscal years in total. And so then once that is were no other changes to the tax credit programs. And actually, I do take that back. I do want to go back to another item, and that's why I had a tab there. On page 134, the Nevada New Markets Job Act tax credit program, which was originally put into place in the 2013 session. And so basically what that program has allowed is insurance companies to make investments into development corporations who then make low interest loans to businesses in distressed census tracts, low income areas, and the like. And that program was originally funded for $200 million of total investment, of which there was a 58% tax credit return, so $116 million in tax credits. Then it was reauthorized again in Assembly Bill 446 of the 2019 session, with those tax credits beginning in FY 22. And so it would go for 5 years after that. So FY 22, 23, 24, 25, and 26, there would be tax credits available. During the 2023 session, the legislature passed Senate Bill 440, which authorized tax credits for a third round beginning in FY 2027. So for 27, 28, 29, 30, and 31, there will be tax credits for new markets that will continue, which when we get to those forecasts, and it would be actually the last year of the next biennium for this cycle, we'll have to take that into account. But there will be another round of those credits and subsequent reductions to the general fund relating to those. So I apologize for skipping that the first time, but that is all I had for Table 3. So if there are any questions to wrap this up, I would be glad to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay. Since there are no questions, we'll move on to Agenda Item 8, report and discussion of the FY 2023 actual collections compared to the Economic Forum December 3rd, 2020, May 4th, 2021, December 5th, 2022, and May 1st, 2023 forecast. adjusted for the legislative actions approved during the 2023 session and the 34th and 35th special sessions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And for this agenda item, we will go up to Carson City, and Mr. Tower will be doing the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamoto. Thank you, Chair. My name is Christian Tower. I'm a Deputy Fiscal Analyst with the Fiscal Analysis Division, and I will be presenting on agenda item 8 today, which begins on page 139 of the meeting package. And I will bring that up on the screen as well right now. So on page 139 and on the screen, you see Table 1, which compares actual revenues collections with adjusted forecasts for selected major and non-major revenue sources for fiscal year 2023. And so the forecasts we compare the actuals to have been adjusted by legislative actions, as just presented by Mr. Nakamoto under agenda item 7, to the extent these legislative actions affect the forecast and revenues in fiscal year 2023. As you can see, looking at the table, there are 4 major columns with data, reflecting that there's a total of 4 different forecasts for every odd-numbered fiscal year, such as fiscal year 2023, 2 per forecast cycle. So on the left-hand side, you see the first forecast cycle of December 2020 and May 2021, where economic forum meetings included forecasts for fiscal year 2023 as the second or last fiscal year of the 2021 to 23 biennium. On the left-hand side, you find December 2022 and May 2023 Economic Forum meeting forecasts, featuring forecasts for fiscal year 2023 as the current year of the 2023-25 biennium. And the big difference, of course, between the 2023 to 25 biennium forecast, which has fiscal year 2023 as a current year, and the previous forecast cycle is that the forecast for the current year can take into account already actual revenue collections of the year that is being forecast. So the May 2023 forecast could make use of up to 8 months of data of actual revenue collections in fiscal year 2023. So effectively, the May 2023 forecast did forecast the last 4 months of fiscal year 2023. And naturally, that comes with a higher accuracy, at least under normal conditions, than the forecast of the previous cycle, so the December 2020 forecast and the May 2021 forecast, that really had to forecast fiscal year 2023 2 years ahead. And also as a reminder, in December 2020 and in May 2021, when the Economic Forum and forecasters were looking at fiscal year 2023, forecasters were still under the impression of the COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictions the pandemic induced and the economic disruptions, the restrictions that were associated with the pandemic were causing. And at that point, really, there was no real way to foresee or anticipate how the situation would develop going forward in fiscal year 2023. The hope was certainly that pandemic-induced restrictions would have been lifted, and the hope was certainly that the economy would recover. But the extent to which the economy would bounce back, or issues like inflation or pent-up demand that were driving our revenues in fiscal year 2023, were difficult, if not impossible, to forecast at that stage in December 2020 or in May 2021. And this difference, the reason why I elaborate on it, is that if you look at the numbers in the table, you see relatively significant variance between the forecasts and actual collections for the December 2020 forecast and the May 21 forecast. Whereas if you move to the current year forecast of December 22 and May 2023, you see that the variance is very small between actual collections and forecast. And that has something to do, of course, not only with, as mentioned, that the current year forecast can take into account actual collections already, but it has also something to do with the tremendous uncertainty under which forecasters were forecasting fiscal year 2023 in December 2020 and May 21. If you look at the rows, you see first information on the sales and use tax actuals in bold. So in fiscal year 2023, the sales and use tax generated $1.722 billion in revenues. Underneath, you find the Economic Forum forecast numbers, and including the difference between the Economic Forum forecast revenues and the actual revenues. Further underneath, you find the forecast presented to the Economic Forum at the respective meetings from the agency, Fiscal Analysis Division, the Budget Division, and for the sales and use tax and the percentage fee tax, also Moody's Analytics. So apart from the sales and use tax, you find on page 139 also the forecast accuracy analysis for the percentage fee tax, insurance premium tax, the live entertainment taxes. And then if you move on to page 140, further major revenue sources such as on the commerce tax, the modified business taxes, the real property transfer tax. On page 141, you find the same analysis for selected non-major general fund revenue sources, such as the cigarette tax, governmental services tax, and other taxes. And finally, if you scroll down to page 143, you find information on tax credit programs. And finally, at the bottom of page 144, you find the forecast accuracy analysis for total general fund revenues net any tax credit programs. And we see here that the actual total general fund revenues net any tax credit programs in fiscal year 2023 amounted to $5.762 billion. And you can see when you look at the Economic Forum forecast and the individual forecasters that the December 2020 forecast and the May 2021 forecast was significantly under forecasting the general fund revenues in December 2020 by about $1.4 billion. Whereas if you move to the right of the table at the bottom of page 144, you see that the May 1st, 2023 forecast is within $43.8 million within reach of the actuals. The Economic Forum forecast did under forecast the actual revenues by $43.8 million. I would now move on to page 147 and table number 2, which is similar to table 1, also compares or provides information on actual revenues versus adjusted forecasts, collections for fiscal year 2023. Different to table 1, however, table 2 only provides this information with respect to the December 2020 and May 2023 Economic Forum forecasts, and thus does not include the 2-year ahead forecast for fiscal year 2023, and does also not include information on the forecast presented to the Economic Forum by the different forecasters, the agency forecast, budget forecast, fiscal analysis division forecast, and Moody's forecast. It's only the Economic Forum forecast for fiscal year 2023 that is being compared with the actuals. But Table 1 also provides more information, namely it includes a detailed account, including all general fund revenue sources, their actual numbers for fiscal year 2022 and fiscal year 2023, in comparison to the Economic Forum December 2022 and May 2023 forecast for fiscal year 2023. And when you look at page 147, it starts on page one, it starts with the mining taxes, and Mr. Nakamoto has already explained the legislative actions in the previous, in this legislative session, the 2023 legislative session, and previous legislative session and special sessions. So I'm not going to repeat this. If you go further down, then you find the real major revenue sources of the sales tax, the 2% sales tax, including the commissions that are being deposited into the general fund for the collection of the local sales tax portions. Underneath, you find the gaming percentage fee tax and other gaming taxes. If you go further down the page, you find the live entertainment taxes, or information about that, and the numbers for forecasts and the actuals, the commerce tax, the transportation excess tax, and cigarette tax. You move to page 148, you find further major revenue sources, the modified business taxes, and the actuals and forecasts concerning the moderate business taxes, modified business taxes, I apologize. Moving further down to page 149, you find information on the real property transfer tax, the insurance premium tax, government service tax, and other taxes. Finally, if we go all the way down to page 151, you see in the last line at the bottom of the table the total general fund revenues after tax credits, and we see again that in fiscal year 2023, the actual revenue collections amounted to $5.62 billion, which, as you can see in the table, is about $43.8 million difference to the May 2023 forecast of the Economic Forum. And that would conclude my run-through through these tables, comparing actuals to forecasts, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
I don't think we can complain too much for the differences. They're fairly close. One question I'd like to ask though, as it relates to, is a little bit concerning, as it relates, the amounts are not very large, but I just wanted to, on sales tax, sales and use tax, we estimated a little higher than it actually came in, and which means, of course, that sales tax has grown so much during the, even performed so well during the pandemic even. And I wonder if is there something that we can identify as causing that. The amounts are not large, but I'm just curious as to if there's something that we can identify that's likely the source of that difference.
Mr. Levitt, it's Michael Nakamoto with the Fiscal Analysis for the Division for the Record. We're working on that. We're trying to get a handle on what the difference is, and it is something that we have been keeping our eyes on, because you're right. We were doing very well on taxable sales. In fact, as the tables that Mr. Tower went through, we came in during the May meeting and increased the forecast for FY23 because taxable sales were holding up through the first several months of FY23. And then we got past that meeting, and all of a sudden the collections were just not coming in. And it was something that we were just keeping an eye on, and it's like, okay, maybe it was just a 1 month thing, and then the second month came and it was the same thing. And before we knew it, we were almost $27 million short of the forecast at the end of the year. It is a trend as we get to the next agenda item that is continuing a little bit. We are below the forecast in the sales tax also. Fortunately, we do have some other taxes that are propping that up right now, as I will go through, but right now we're keeping an eye on the sales tax, and we will see whether it was, we're trying to figure out whether it was something specific that happened, or the expectations for the forecasts were just too high, and it was just something that was not necessarily sustainable. But that is definitely something we are keeping our eyes on.
Yeah, one thing, of course, the sales tax, probably of any tax we've got, is the most broad that reaches almost every section somehow or other of the economy. And so if we see an adjustment of that, then it at least makes us, if not concerned, at least want to know what's causing the situation so we can identify it if it's in the future.
And this is Michael Nakamoto for the record again. One of the other things that I will note is 26.5 or $26.1 million is the actual amount that we were short. That's 1.5%. And so it's a big number in terms of the grand scheme of things, especially given that the forecast net of tax credits was $43.8 million above the forecast. So had we not been there, we would have been closer to 70 million. But it's also 1.5% of $1.7 billion. So in terms of the tax itself, it's not a huge amount. But again, the fact that we were showing very strong taxable sales coming out of the pandemic, and then all of a sudden they weakened, and it's something that we are definitely keeping our eyes on, because it was something, obviously, when we came to this body back in May, that we were not anticipating seeing.
Yeah, because I was thinking when we did our estimates in May, when we were considering that, I was thinking we did a conservative estimate, and it turned out it was, like you say, the numbers are small in comparison to the totals, but it's just it'd be nice to know anyway what's causing it if we can find out.
Yeah, and that is something that we are monitoring, and we will continue to monitor for the forum going forward.
I don't believe we have any further questions on this agenda item.
I do have just one comment that I would like to make. And it really goes back, and Mr. Tower talked about it in Table 1. And when you go look at page 144 and look at those totals, and it's something that I think I've mentioned to this body before in previous presentations, but we always talk as forecasters about the difficulty of forecasting during a recession. But in a lot of ways, it is difficult forecasting coming out of a recession also, and I think this is a perfect example of that. Those of us who were here as part of this body are the forecasters, and three of them are part of the staff. So myself, as well as Ms. Powers, who was previously at the budget office, as well as now Ms. Owens, who is the economist at the Department of Taxation at this point. If you asked any of them, or if you ask perhaps Mr. Lawton or anybody who was presenting that day, that if we had presented forecasts to you back in December of 2020 or May of 2021 that said that the general fund is going to be at $5.8 billion, you would have looked at us like we had sprouted one head on this side and one head on this side to go with the one we already had. It would have been, you couldn't have even fathomed that we would be talking about the type of revenue that we have. As you can see, we were at $4.4 billion in December, and then we even got to $4.6 billion in May of 2021, and we were still $1.1 billion below the actuals. And it speaks to the difficulty of forecasting and the difficulty of this entire process, of especially as you are coming out of a situation like the pandemic. So to get to the point that we were and have it be, okay, we have better information, we've got a better handle on this, I think we did pretty good to get to $43.8 billion, or $43.8 million in the end. But that's just the only observation that I would have as one of the forecasters and as staff to this committee. Thank you.
Moving on to agenda item number 9, we'll have a report and discussion of the FY24 year-to-date actual collections compared to this body's forecast on May 1st, 23, adjusted for the legislative actions that we've previously discussed.
And I will take that agenda item today, Madam Chair. Again, Michael Nakamoto with the Fiscal Analysis Division for the record. And so agenda item 9 begins on page 157 of the packet today. And these are the tables that you have seen before that go through both major and select non-major revenues before and after tax credits, and I'll walk through these tables very briefly to give an overview of what is contained within this. One of the things that I will note, though, is that for a number of reasons, the most recent information that we received from the Department of Taxation, the Gaming Control Board, and some of the other agencies, due to the holiday and some other things, we didn't get the information until last week. We were made aware of a number of technical issues as several of the agencies, and as a result, rather than trying to fight through that and give perhaps what is bad information, even though it would be the most recent information, we decided instead of reporting through the end of November. The information contained within these tables are through the end of October. So it's only 2 months of sales tax and some of the major revenues. We have 4 months of the gaming percentage fee and so on, but I'll walk through that. One of the things that we'll get to in agenda item 13 is the reports of the Interim Finance Committee. It is your staff's intention, once we've worked through some of these technical issues through this week, to update these tables. And so when we make that report to the Interim Finance Committee, we would like to do it through the end of November and present that to the IFC. And as soon as we have that report ready, we will make it available on the Economic Forum's website as well and provide it to you as the members of the forum. But that having been said, I'll walk through these tables very quickly. And the first is Table 1. Goes through the major and select non-major revenues, as you can see there, and it shows the FY23 actuals that Mr. Tower had in the previous agenda item, as well as the actual percentage change, as well as what the forecasted percentage change was from the May 1st Economic Forum forecast. And the reason why then that becomes relevant is you get to FY24 and we show the Economic Forum's forecast, and so then we show what the forecast change was that the Economic Forum said back based on the 23 forecast, but then we provide the FY24 forecast percentage change based on where the actual landed. So, for example, in the sales and use tax for FY24, that $1.843 billion was forecast in May 1st as a 5.5% change. But because the actual collections for FY23 were below the forecast, we now need a 7.1% increase in the sales and use tax to hit that same forecast. So we go through and do that for these majors and non-majors, as well as the total general fund. So then on the following page, on page 158, is Table 2. This is where we start looking at the year-to-date actuals as well as the year-to-date forecast for FY24. So that yellow column is the actual year-to-date through the reference period for each of these revenues for FY23, and then the orange column is the year-to-date actual collections for that same reference period, and we list the reference period next to each of those tax types. So for the sales and use tax, it's for the first 2 months of collections, so July and August collections for each for the sales and use tax. So the 23 actual for those first 2 months, and then the 24 actual, and then in the green column is the year-to-date forecast. So it's that Economic Forum forecast. Then we calibrate it back to a monthly collection amount to show what the forecast is. And so you can see through the first 2 months, we're approximately $3.6 million below the forecast for the sales and use tax. And we walk through and can see that the percentage fees are approximately $9.4 million through October, which is the first 4 months of the tax. The insurance premium tax, the modified business tax, the real property transfer tax, and that major forecast, those are quarterly taxes. Those would have been the information that we would have been reporting had we included November, because we have the first quarter collections available to us, but because of those technical issues, we just rolled everything back. But that'll be the information that will be available for the IFC, and we'll make that available to you as well. And then for the live entertainment tax, you can see so far that we're approximately $10.2 million above the forecast for the combined gaming and non-gaming portions, with about a 50-50 split between the two for the first 3 months of the LET gaming, and approximately the same for the first 2 months of the LET non-gaming. The commerce tax is one that's a little bit misleading, because that's an annual tax that's paid at the end of the fiscal year. But so far, those early collections, and usually what it is, it's late returns from the previous fiscal year that get paid at the beginning of the fiscal year. Those are coming in a little less than the forecast, but that's something that will sort itself out as we get later in the fiscal year, with the bulk of the collections being at the end. And then through the, so the total major general fund revenues right now are approximately $12.1 million above the forecast. And then so for the selected non-major general fund revenues, you can see we're approximately $9.8 million below the forecast, with half of that, about or close to half of that, being the transportation connection excise tax, the Uber Lyft tax, which is approximately $4.3 million below the forecast, as well as the business license fee administered by the Secretary of State's office, which is approximately $2.8 million below the forecast. And then underneath that, you can see the all other general fund revenues. So that's everything else on the economic forum sheets that's not listed here, which is approximately $6 million above the forecast, which gets us to a bottom line of being approximately $8.4 million above the forecast through October. When we get everything sorted out with November, we'll have new tables to show. And one of the things that I'll point out is that this is before tax credits. So tax credits, to the extent there are any, are not figured into this. So on table 3, this is basically showing the collections for FY23 and FY24 that are remaining to either hit that FY23 actual, or that would need to be hit for the FY24 forecast. So on that one, you can see that there are still 100% of the collections still need to be collected for the RPTT, the insurance premium tax, and the MBT, but then the rest of them have been reduced because there have been some collections that have come in, with the exception of the governmental services tax, with the forecast being 0. There are no collections for that will be collected. And then tables 4 and 5 are basically the same information as tables 1 and 2, but it's net of the tax credits. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those, just other than to point out that because the practice for us has been to not balance the tax credits or deal with those until the end of the fiscal year. The amount net of tax credits at the bottom of table 4, that $8.4 million, is identical to what we show on table 2. Because the way that we have done the forecasts for the tax credits is we do not allocate or try to forecast the individual tax types for some of the tax credits where they could be applied to the insurance premium tax or gaming or the MBT, rather than we just have the full amount at the bottom, and then we'll account for those at the end of the year. So to deal with that in the meantime, we just have the net and gross numbers balance. And then table 6 is just an accounting of the tax credits by type and by revenue source. Right now, the only tax credits that we are carrying as actuals this year are approximately $1.8 million in film tax credits that have been taken against the gaming percentage fee, because we've got a few months of those. When we have the updated tables, we will show commerce tax credits, we'll show taxes, credits taken against the insurance premium tax and the MBT, because those will have been reported to us. And we have some of that information. We're just waiting for some of these technical issues again to be worked out. So right now, it's kind of early in the fiscal year to tell, but we are just slightly above the forecast. And then as we get that additional information for the next month and for the first quarter, we will provide that to you. So I don't know if there are any questions, but this would be a good time to ask them. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Go ahead.
Thank you. Brian Gordon for the record. Thank you, Mr. Nakamoto. This is very helpful and detailed and informative. I noticed a couple of things related to the live entertainment tax, both on the fiscal 23 and then the fiscal 24. They seem to be tracking pretty well, and my sense is that it's related to a number of special events that have been taking place in the state, in particular in Southern Nevada, a number of concerts and major events, including most recently Formula One in the fiscal 24 period. I may be covering ground that this group has already talked about, but understanding the timing of some of those live entertainment tax collections and how that's reflected in the reporting here would just be helpful for me in terms of understanding, I suppose, if there's a difference between the gaming and the non-gaming piece and the timing elements of each one of those.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. For the record, Michael Nakamoto with the Fiscal Analysis Division. And this one is, the easy answer to your question is yes and no. We have been tracking. There has been a lot of discussion about various events as it relates to the LET, Formula One and the Super Bowl, and whether the Raiders are going to be in the Super Bowl or not in the Super Bowl. And any of these have all been discussion points. The various, for the gaming portion, the residencies of Garth Brooks and all of these people who are showing up, Miranda Lambert. I've been down here for the last few days, so I've seen a lot of these billboards for all of these people, and it just astounds me that you have this type of event schedule going on, but they continue to come. So it's one of those things that we try and keep our eyes on, especially Mr. Lawton at the board, who is talking to the properties and getting a lot of information that we use and we keep in mind for our forecasts. And then on the non-gaming side, the Super Bowl obviously got talked about, Formula One got talked about. I know NFR is starting this week, and that's going to be included. But just even in the amount of time that I've been here, tickets for the Rolling Stones are going to go or have gone on sale, and I can't afford that, but I could afford to go to Barry Manilow on Saturday night, and I did that. It was a good show. I'm not gonna, please don't judge. But those are the types of things that we keep, try and keep a handle, and we look at these things. But when you turn the corner, it's like, no, you get a handle on all of these activities and these events that are going on, and then they announce something else. And it's like, in the time that I've been down here since Friday. I went to the Depeche Mode concert on Friday night, but in that time you had the Pac-12 championship, you had the Mountain West championship, you had the basketball games at MGM on Saturday night, and these were just the things that I was observing around me. And this is aside from any of the other non-gaming LET events that were going on. And again, I mean, the Rolling Stones are announcing a tour, and they are charging a lot of money for tickets for that show. The cheapest ticket I saw was just under $200 to sit in the upper deck of Allegiant Stadium. And so when you start thinking about events like that, and somebody else could announce a concert coming up and we have no idea. And that's just kind of what we face with the LET, is that Las Vegas continues to bring these events, and it just is adding to those numbers. And with respect to your other question about the timing, it is slightly different between the gaming and the non-gaming portion. The Department of Taxation requires that the taxes be collected and remitted to them when the tickets are sold. That actually did cause some issues with Formula One, because when we were originally looking at Formula One, or this body, I think a lot of the forecasts anticipated that the effect of the LET would happen in FY24 because the race was in November. But between that December meeting and the May meeting, F1 started putting some of their tickets on sale, which then triggered the tax and had it remitted. So we were seeing a lot of those collections coming in FY23. And so those are the kind of things we are looking at. It's like, okay, if Taylor Swift is having a concert in August, but the tickets go on sale in April, then it's the timing that we have to look at also. It's different on the gaming side, where the tax is not remitted to the Gaming Control Board until the event occurs. But that's the difference between the two. So I don't know if all of that answered all of your questions, or if you have any additional ones for me.
No, thank you, Mr. Nakamoto. That was perfect. That's exactly what I was looking for. I think events like Formula One, you're going to see, my sense is you're going to see probably the biggest LET generating event in Nevada's history. And so understanding the timing of it, not only for our purposes of evaluating where we've been relative to the forecast, but on a go-forward basis too, that timing element will be important as this group does its work going forward. So that's very helpful. Thank you.
And Michael Nakamoto, for the record, I would think for the LET, a lot of the increases that you're seeing above the forecast already are due to Formula One because of that timing issue, because the tickets have already been sold and the event had already happened. Had this been a gaming event, we would have been waiting for the collections to, or the taxes to actually be remitted and then reported by the Gaming Control Board. One of the things, or the things that we are waiting on, though, with respect to Formula One, are the non-race things, such as the gaming percentage fee and the effect on the gaming tax, which we should see at the end of this month. And then as it relates to the sales tax, when the Department of Taxation releases taxable sales at the end of January, that will be for November collections. So by the time that the Economic Forum meets on or before June 10th, we'll have a pretty good idea of that, as well as some of the other special events such as the Super Bowl and the things that we would ordinarily be tracking otherwise.
Linda Rosenthal, for the record, would it be possible to request at the next meeting that maybe, I don't know, the top 5 non-gaming events or something, where we could actually get the breakdown of the tax generated by those events?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Michael Nakamoto, for the record. The answer to that is I don't know. We do have confidentiality statutes that we have to work with respect to taxes that are administered by a lot of the state agencies, and the Department of Taxation is no exception. So I know that there are people from the department watching, both in this room as well as elsewhere. So that is something I will have to talk to them about before I can commit to providing any information, because oftentimes identifying individual events or taxpayers is often a no-no. But I will look into that, and we'll see what we can do.
Great, understood. Thank you very much. Anything else for this agenda item? No.
Just make a comment. Going over the numbers, I feel pretty good. You know, it's you're happy when you see that forecasts are, and as I mentioned before, I think it looks pretty good to me. Everything other than I'm a little bit concerned about, like Mike mentioned, the sales tax, as to what that is. It's interesting that, say, the insurance premium tax, which is pretty much always good, but it's even better than we'd estimate, and that's a fairly wide, general tax too. And I'm just curious when we find out what that slight dip in the sales tax is caused by.
Thank you, Mr. Levitt. Again, Michael Nakamoto for the record, and we will be tracking those as we do all of these. Just as a general observation, I think we are fortunate that some of these other taxes are holding up and allowing us to be in a state where at least we're holding our own, not showing $1 billion in excess revenue, but at the same time that we're above water as opposed to treading it. So we'll keep an eye on those. As there, from a personal standpoint, or some. I'm curious about the insurance premium tax and how that's going to do. Just some information that I've been seeing about premiums for auto insurance increasing. It's both as a personal, but just as other observations. I think my insurance went up by about 20%, and I'm hearing that that's a common thing coming out of the pandemic for a number of reasons. So the effect that that will have on collections going forward for this fiscal year, as well as when we get into the next forecast cycle, and for that as well as some of the other taxes, including the sales tax, to see what is going on and what it means.
Great. Moving on, we'll go to agenda item 10, which is a report on the forecast accuracy by forecaster for selected revenues.
And for agenda item 10, again, we'll be going up to Carson City, and it'll be Mr. Tower. And you have the forecast accuracy report outside of the packet. It's gotten big enough that we decided that it does not need to be a part of the packet, but we have it as a separate document.
Thank you. Christian Tower, Deputy Fiscal Analyst with the Fiscal Analysis Division for the record. I will also bring the accuracy report up on the screen. The report is a regular item on the agenda of the Economic Forum's odd-year December meetings. It provides information on the historical average variance between forecasts and actuals for selected major revenues. The report is 64 pages long, and I will not present it in detail, but discuss the overall picture of forecast accuracy in the report. As to the structure of the report, forum members will find the table of contents right after the cover page of the report. As the table of contents shows, the report begins with several introductory and background sections providing a summary of the report, information on the Economic Forum's forecast process, and a description of the method of evaluating forecast error in the report. The table of contents also shows the selected major revenues featured in the report. Featured are the state 2% sales tax, the gaming percentage fee tax, insurance premium tax, casino live entertainment tax, the cigarette tax, total general fund revenues, the modified business taxes, real property transfer tax, and the commerce tax. Just for illustrative purposes, if we open on page 35, go there, we find the information on total general fund revenues, beginning in the forecast over the fiscal year 1995 to 1997 forecast cycle. On page 36, we find information on forecast accuracy for the previous 2021 to 23 biennium at the bottom of the page, and the biennium before that, the 2019 to 2021 biennium. And what we can see here, if we look at the May 19 forecast of 2029 and how it fared over the biennium, we see that the forecast was by 6.6% over the actual revenues collected during the biennium. And that, of course, has something to do with the pandemic that unfolded then, and which was at that time unknown to the forecasters in May of 2019. As Mr. Nakamoto said, there's a lot to say about the difficulties of forecasting a recession, and that is exactly the situation that characterizes the forecast accuracy over the 2019 to 21 biennium. At the bottom of the page, you see the forecast, the May forecast as well, for the 21 to 23 biennium, and you see that the Economic Forum, as discussed in under the previous items, under-forecasted the actual revenues by 18.8% in May of 2021. And as Mr. Nakamoto has pointed out, what explains this is that not only recessions are difficult to forecast, but also bouncing back from a recession and the economic growth that unfolds afterwards proved to be very difficult to forecast. Moving to the overall picture of forecast accuracy over time, the table on numbered page 2 of the report is instructive. You see here the average percent forecast error and absolute average percent forecast errors listed for the for the state 2% sales tax, the gaming percentage fees taxes, the insurance premium tax, the casino life entertainment tax, cigarette tax, total general fund revenues, modified business taxes, and real property transfer tax. The last biennium included in the statistics is, as just shown with respect to the general funds, the 21 to 23 biennium. More specifically included is the May 2021 Economic Forum forecast for fiscal year 2022 and fiscal year 2023, and its variance to the actual revenues in fiscal year 2022 and fiscal year 2023 in terms of absolute and relative percentages. The absolute average percent forecast error is probably the most relevant indication for forecast accuracy. It measures the average distance of forecast to realized actual revenues without allowing positive and negative forecast errors to cancel each other out. So to illustrate, if the absolute average forecast error of the May forecast for a specific revenue source is 5% for the biennium, this means that the May forecasts for each biennium are on average within 5% plus or minus of the actual collections. As you can see from the table, the absolute average percent forecast error for the state 2% sales tax is 6.5%. For gaming percentage fees is 7.9%. Insurance premium tax 6.1%. Casino life and entertainment tax 20.6%. Cigarette tax 4.7%. And total general fund revenues 6.3%. Note, however, as discussed already at several occasions during this meeting and just mentioned, that these averages include the forecast error percentages of periods marked by the effects of major exogenous shocks, recessions, and bounce backs to the economy, which are difficult, if not impossible, to forecast, such as the Great Recession during the 2007-9 biennium, or COVID-19, the disruption it caused to the economy, and the unexpected rebound of the economy after the pandemic during the 2019-21 and 21-23 biennia. And just for your reference, once we take out the two most affected biennia by these recessions, so the 2007-9 Great Recession biennium and the 21-23 bounce back after COVID biennium, if we take these out of the statistic, the absolute average percent forecast error of the 2% state sales tax goes down to 4.1%. For the gaming percentage fees, it would go down to 5.2%. And for the overall general fund revenues, it will go down to 4.2%. So if we take these difficult to forecast scenarios or events like the COVID pandemic and the Great Recession out of the statistics, the forecast error converges to a margin between 4 and 5%, roughly. And with that, I would finish the presentation of the report and are happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Moving on to agenda item 11, presentation on personal income and wages in relation to population, employment, and inflation on a national level and in the state of Nevada.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Michael Nakamoto with Fiscal Analysis Division. For this agenda item, we'll be going back up to Carson City, and Ms. Powers will be doing the presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, Madam Chair and the members of the Economic Forum. Susanna Powers, Deputy Fiscal Analyst with the Fiscal Analysis Division. I just need a quick minute here to find the right page for my presentation here. I'm almost there. Okay, looking familiar. Okay, there we go. So this presentation starts on page 179 of your meeting packet. All right. Perfect. The first 5 slides overlap with the employment and population outlook presentation given by Mr. Smith and the demographer earlier. So I will be focusing more on income and wages on per capita, per employee and inflation-adjusted basis, and we'll be actually picking up from my 6th slide. So I'm going to be skipping here about 5 pages, not to repeat any previous information. So we are going to be starting from consumer price index. So starting with inflation. This slide shows selected components for the CPI, Consumer Price Index. The CPI for all items is the red line here. The CPI for food is the green line. The core CPI, which covers all items less food and energy, is represented by the blue line, and the CPI for energy is displayed by the purple line. Inflation was fairly noticeable for decades, but as we all know, in recent times, it has been our top concern. We have seen a robust recovery in many economic metrics, but the income and wage slides in this presentation will show how we are not doing as well on inflation-adjusted terms because inflation has eroded our purchasing power. Moving on to the next slide, that will be page 186 of your meeting packet. In this chart, the red line still represents the overall CPI, the measure we know as the headline inflation indicator for all items. Inflation has been trending down from the peak of 8.6% reached at mid-year mark of last year. The inflation rate was down to 3.6% year over year in the 3rd quarter of this year. The blue line represents the core inflation, which removes the volatile food and energy components. Based on this measure, we still have a 4.4% inflation rate compared to a year ago. In the next slide, a little more on CPI and core CPI. As seen in the purple line, the energy component has been the largest contributor to change in the CPI. The energy prices were down 5.6% year over year in the 3rd quarter. Food prices remain elevated. The food component of the CPI, represented by the green line, is up by 4.3% year over year. The next slide moves on to personal income components. The first slide is for the United States. This chart shows the pieces and the respective shares of the total personal income for the U.S. through the 2nd quarter of this year. This data is from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Personal income includes all earnings, including salaries and wages, investments, and other sources. The largest share of personal income is wages and salaries that is represented by the red line. Typically, this share is about 50% of all personal income. The shape of the letter W that formed in that red line during the pandemic time period is the result of lost wages and salaries. Government transfers in the form of money, income, and in-kind benefits accounted for about 17% of total personal income prior to the pandemic response by the federal government, a line represented by the blue line. This share is now at around 18%. A big takeaway from this slide is the magnitude of the role the government transfer payments played in 2020 and 2021 in response to the lost wages and salaries due to the pandemic. The next slide shows the same components for Nevada. Nevada's story for personal income components is similar to the previous nationwide slide, except that the drop in the share of wages and salaries as a percent of total personal income was larger than for the U.S., and the increase in the share of transfer payments as a percent of total personal income in 2020 and 2021 was more pronounced than what they were for the U.S. The next slide is shifting to U.S. total personal income and total wages and salaries. Personal income in a red line shows the two spikes coinciding with the federal stimulus and other programs in 2020 and 2021. As a result, we do not see the typical peak to trough and recovery pattern associated with economic downturns. It looks more like peak to peak and back to trend. When compared to 2020 Q1, the last period before the pandemic started, personal income is up by 21.9%. The wages and salaries in the black line show a more typical pattern of the last peak, then trough, and subsequent recovery. When compared to 2020 Q1, wages and salaries are up by 22.1%. The next slide shows the same information for Nevada, and the narrative is very similar. When compared to 2021 Q1, personal income is up by 25.8%, and wages and salaries are up by 26.5%. Then the next slide compares the growth rates for personal income between the U.S. and Nevada. The takeaway here is that since the onset of the pandemic, Nevada's personal income growth has averaged 7.4% compared to the 6.2% for the U.S., so it has been a little stronger. The next slide does the same growth rate comparison for the U.S. and Nevada, but for wages and salaries. We can see that during normal times, Nevada's wage and salary growth tends to outpace that of the U.S. When looking at the recent shocks to the economic system, the magnitude of the decline in wage and salary growth are deeper for Nevada than for the U.S. Since the second quarter of 2020, Nevada has outpaced the U.S. With a growth rate of 8.5% compared to 6.3% for the U.S. The next slide looks at things on per capita basis. So we're looking at per capita personal income for the U.S., bringing in the population component. Compared to the quarter preceding the start of the pandemic, per capita personal income is up 20.5%. However, when adjusted for inflation, it is up 2.8% during that period. Looking at that information for Nevada in nominal terms, Nevada per capita personal income is up 21.2% since the first quarter of 2020, and when we adjust that for inflation, it is up by 3.4% during that period. Here, the growth rates are just being considered on a nominal basis between the U.S. and Nevada. U.S. is at 20.5% versus 21.2% for Nevada when comparing the recovery from the first quarter of 2020 to the most recent quarter available, which is the second quarter of 2023. Then the next slide does the comparison on the inflation-adjusted basis, showing that the U.S. per capita personal income percent change was up 2.8% versus a 3.4% for Nevada. Then looking at the per capita personal income growth rates, comparing U.S. and Nevada, since the onset of the pandemic in terms of per capita personal income growth rates, Nevada has performed slightly better compared to the U.S. For the last 3 years, the U.S. per capita personal income growth has averaged 5.9% compared to 6.2% for Nevada. On inflation-adjusted basis, the per capita personal income growth is only 1.1% for the U.S. and 1.4% for Nevada. Then I will be moving on to U.S. wages and salaries, and now comparing on per employee basis. When the pandemic hit, there was a large decline in lower wage jobs, leading to a somewhat sharper increase in wages and salaries per employee. As you can see in the data, I'm hovering my mouse around that area. Looking at the year 2020, you can see that there's a sharp increase in wages and salaries per employee. That corresponds with the year 2020. It was because of the cost of the pandemic-induced recession was disproportionately borne by lower wage workers, as they experienced a bigger share of job and wage losses than those with higher incomes. As employment has recovered, we have seen a robust growth in employee wages and salaries. When comparing to the quarter that preceded the start of the pandemic, wages and salaries per employee are up 18.9%, yet when adjusted for inflation, wages and salaries are up only by 1.5% during this period. In the next slide, we have the same information for Nevada. We can see the same pattern of a sudden upward movement in wages and salaries per employee in Nevada in response to large losses of jobs associated with lower wage sectors such as leisure and hospitality. In nominal terms, Nevada wages and salaries per employee are up 18% since the first quarter of 2020. However, when adjusted for the effects of inflation, wages and salaries on a per employee basis are up 0.7% for that period. In the next slide, it summarizes the last two slides for wages and salaries per employee in nominal terms. And this is just a comparison between the US and Nevada. Just putting them together, it is interesting to note that the widened gap between the US and Nevada that occurred after the Great Recession has never really narrowed. In the next slide, we have the inflation-adjusted comparison between the US and Nevada when it comes to wages and salaries per employee. So it's just a summary. The US percent change from the Q1 20 to Q2 23 is 1.5% versus the 0.7 for Nevada. Moving on to the following slide. This slide is looking at the wage and salary per employee growth rates between US and Nevada. And this is on nominal terms. No, this is actually looking at what we have done on average since the recovery from the pandemic. So for the last 3 years, the US has averaged a growth rate of 5.6% compared to 5.8% for Nevada. And then let's look at on inflation-adjusted basis what that recovery on average has looked like. Wages and salaries per employee grew only by 0.8% for the US and slightly better for Nevada at 1%. The next slide switches to median household income. This slide compares the United States versus Nevada. The big focus here is between 2019 and 2022. If we go prior to the Great Recession, Nevada's median household income exceeded that of the US, but has remained below the US since. This trend was briefly reversed in 2019, but it fell again below the US at the onset of the pandemic. Between 2019 and 2022, the median household income rose by 8.6% for the US and by 2% for Nevada. This data comes from the Census Bureau, so it's a little bit lagged. The year 2022 is the last year we have currently. The next slide takes a look at the median household income, inflation adjusted, compares the US versus Nevada. When adjusted for inflation, the US median household income fell by 5.2% between 2019 and 2022. The Nevada median household income declined by 10.9% in that time comparison between 2019 and 2022. The next slide looks at the growth rates for median household income comparing the US versus Nevada. So we have the comparisons from the page 27 slide, so 2 pages prior, just transforming that data into growth rates. So this compares the US versus Nevada between 2019 and 2022. So you saw these text boxes earlier. The percent change for the US is 8.6 versus the 2% for Nevada between 2019 and 2022. And then the next slide does the same growth rate calculation for the data you saw earlier for US and Nevada median household income and puts it into a growth basis. So if we do the comparison here on inflation-adjusted basis, the median household income fell by 5.2% for the US between 2019 and 2022 and declined by 10.9% for Nevada for that same time period. There are 2 more slides left in this deck. So the second last slide shows Nevada general fund revenue per $1,000 of Nevada personal income by fiscal year. It just shows how this series has changed over time. It is really the next slide that is a little more telling. The last slide shows how the general fund and personal income growth rates have performed over time. So just looking at the growth rates instead of the levels. The first observation here is that the trend between the 2 series tend to move together. If you look at how the general fund revenue growth rate has performed, the blue line versus the red line, which tracks the personal income growth rates. So they tend to move together, and it makes sense. The state's general fund receives a large portion of revenue from sources that are supported by personal income. And the second and the last observation I'm going to make out of this slide is that while our state had record growth in tax revenue collections in fiscal year 2022 compared with the pre-pandemic growth trends, that peak that you see in the blue line occurring in fiscal 22 did not surpass the peak of fiscal year 2004 that followed the 2003 legislative session when major changes were made to taxes. So this does conclude my presentation. It was an update from a presentation I gave you, I believe it was last October, like a year ago, obviously. So this does conclude my presentation. If you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Ms. Powers. Any questions, any members? Thank you very much. Now we'll turn to agenda item 12, a presentation of historical taxable sales, gaming market, and commerce tax statistics. Mr. Nakamoto?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I've moved to the other side of the dais for this agenda item. For the record, Michael Nakamoto with the Fiscal Analysis Division. Just for some background on the previous agenda item as well as agenda item 12, because they kind of go hand in hand. These are kind of the ones that are evolutionary in nature. That is, at some point during a past economic forum meeting, a member of the forum asked for some information, and we decided, hey, you know what, this might be some good idea or information to continue to update. And so agenda item 11 is one that was like that on the statistics on personal income and wages and population and all the things that Ms. Powers just went through. And agenda item 12, the agenda item on taxable sales, gaming market, and commerce tax statistics is another one. like that. The good news, I think, though, is that I'm not going to go through I believe we have 22 sets of charts and tables now that we are accumulating information on. What I will let you know, though, is these are all available for you in Nellis. Two of them are listed under meeting material in Nellis for the commerce tax. It's the tables that update by NAICS code and so the industry-specific information as for the history of the commerce tax going all the way back to FY 2016 through the most current fiscal or the most recent fiscal year, FY 23, and those were updated shortly after the close of the fiscal year back at the end of September. And then the pie charts that show kind of the breakout of the industries and all of that, those have been updated with the most recent information. And then the gaming market statistics are for the monthly information is available through the most recent month. That is what Mr. Lawton and the Gaming Control Board reported on November 30th, as well as the quarterly data through the first quarter. And then for taxable sales, it's the same thing. It's monthly and quarterly information through the first quarter of this fiscal year, which was just reported by the Department of Taxation, I believe, last Wednesday. Again, I'm not going to go through all the information. If you do ever have any questions on those at any point, I would be happy to answer them or get the information for you. Otherwise, we make them available on the website. We don't print them out, but if there are members of the public who would like printed copies of that information, you can contact the Fiscal Analysis Division and we can get that information for you. With that, Madam Chair, I would be glad to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions? I think we're good on that agenda item. Next item is a discussion of the report by the Economic Forum to the Interim Finance Committee required pursuant to NRS 353.228. Mr. Nakamoto?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, Michael Nakamoto with the Fiscal Analysis Division. For the record, the title of the agenda item is actually fairly self-explanatory for these off-year meetings. So this meeting that is to occur on or before December 10th that we're having today, as well as the meeting that occurs on or before June 10th of the even-numbered years, so the one that will be coming up here in about 6 months or so. There is a requirement that either the chair of the Economic Forum or a member of the staff provide an update to the Interim Finance Committee regarding this meeting, as well as any relevant information that was discussed at the meeting. It happens to be that the next Interim Finance Committee meeting is scheduled for next Wednesday, December 13th. And the chair has informed me that she will not be available to make a presentation to IFC at that meeting. So we have an agenda item where I will be providing an update to the Interim Finance Committee to comply with this provision in NRS 353.228. As I noted in the previous agenda item relating to the actual versus forecast collections for FY24, the normal practice is that we provide a report and some information as well as that year-to-date update, but because our intent is to have through November as opposed to what we have provided today through October, the information that will be provided to IFC will take into account this most recent month of collections. And again, we will get that information to the forum and have that available on the website as soon as it is completed. But just to let the other members know that if you would like to tune into the Interim Finance Committee, you'll get a review and rehash of much of the information that was provided for you today. With that, I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the last agenda item, which is public comment. Again, an opportunity for anyone to make their comment. Start down here in Las Vegas. There's one person in the room besides those of us that have been participating in the meeting. So give you the opportunity to make public comment. I'm getting a no, so we'll turn it up to Carson City. Anybody in Carson City who would like to make public comment? Not seeing anybody there either, so I will again turn it over to anybody on the telephone.
The public line is open and working. There are no callers at this time.
Great, thank you.
Madam Chairman, if I could, before we close, I would just like to make a personal comment as to how much I appreciate working with all of you. It's been a real privilege, and I have the utmost respect for all of you. And Chairman, I think you've done a really good job, and look forward to the coming days. But I just wanted to let you know how much I appreciate all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope that wasn't a precursor to resigning. You gave me a little bit of panic there.
I'm not planning on retiring if someone retires me.
Thank you very much for those kind words. Mr. Nakamoto?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Michael Nakamoto for the record. And related to that, just because this is the last meeting of this particular cycle, the next meeting statutorily that would occur will be on or before June 10th. And so a new economic forum will be impaneled, and we'll go through election of chair and vice chair and all of that at this next meeting. But because, again, this is the last meeting of this cycle with the present membership, irrespective of whether all of you will be returning or not returning. On behalf of staff, I would like to thank you all for serving. It has been a pleasure to assist you through this process. Whether all of you are back or not, we will continue with this, and we will continue doing the best that we can for the state. But I would like to thank you for your service to the state of Nevada as well.
Thank you very much. And I think I can speak for all of us when, we couldn't do it without the staff. You guys are amazing. I don't know how you keep all this data straight, and you present it in such a way that it's easy for us to understand and use in our assessment of the forecast. So to the team up in Carson City, and to you especially, thank you. Okay, now that we've all held hands and feel great, I will call for the adjournment of the December 5th, 2023 meeting of the Economic Forum. We are adjourned.